Thank you for joining the conversation here on Ask the Doctor. I'm Amy Gutierrez, and today we're going to explore how to make brain gains and keep them. We're going to discuss fighting dementia. Dr. Wes Youngberg, now with us remotely, and he is quite a wealth of information on the subject. So thank you, Dr. Youngberg, for being here and taking this time with us. But before we discuss what might be wrong with us, let's discuss what's right with you. How are you today? And what do you find is the most amazing thing about our human bodies?
Well, what's right with me today is something that I encourage all my patients who either have dementia or are at risk of dementia, maybe they have family history, and that is having a morning routine that begins with an attitude of gratitude. If you do that, you're well on your way to fighting the culprits that promote dementia over time. It starts with drinking enough water to make up for all the water we've lost over the night. It includes spending some time outside in the morning sunshine, which dramatically improves health of the brain and the rest of the body. I try to include a really healthy breakfast with lots of non-starchy vegetable. Actually, I call it my veggie stir fry. Believe it or not, that's my favorite part of breakfast, and it's really good for the brain. And so that's what is right with me today. What amazes me most about the way God created us is that actually the design of the body is to be able to heal itself if you give it the appropriate factors that allows the body to heal itself. And so the brain is actually able to make new memory neurons every day to the tune of 1,500 every day. The challenge is, are you going to hold on to those new memory neurons, or are you going to blow those up? And so that's, of course, what we're having that discussion for today.
Wow. Well, that's an exciting way to start this conversation on dementia. Tell us a little bit of the big picture with dementia and Alzheimer's. It's affecting so many people worldwide. Can you give us an overview of why this has become such an epidemic?
The bottom line is that there's about 5 major categories of factors that add to the dementia burden. It involves one of the more common, most likely sources or triggers for dementia is actually insulin resistance, which is the beginning of prediabetes and diabetes. So that's number one. Number two is, are there toxins that are contributing? So we know that the world is getting more and more toxic every year. And so our bodies are and our brains are being exposed to more and more toxins. And then we have issues with hormonal loss. Vitamin D, by the way, is a hormone. And if we don't have enough of that, along with other hormones, our brain doesn't do as well. So are we optimizing our hormones appropriately, rationally, in a physiologic way that actually helps heal the brain and prevent dementia? And inflammation is a major cause for promoting dementia, as well as other diseases. And then the fifth one here is, well, cardiovascular. Yeah, so if you have cardiovascular risk factors like diabetes, like prediabetes, like high blood pressure, etc., like excessive weight, all those factors contribute to dementia as well. So we got 5 major categories conspiring to impact our risk. But we have control over many of those risk factors, and the key is, are we doing what is necessary to bring those in check?
It's so interesting to me to hear that, because I don't think that that's a public knowledge out there about these 5 categories that you were just talking about. I'm excited because I think we're going to dig into a few of them coming up. But that is wild. That's really neat that it looks at more than just a genetic background when looking at dementia. What are some eye-opening statistics on the prevalence of Alzheimer's today, and how does it compare to just, say, a few years ago?
We know that, for instance, there was a big study done by Blue Cross and Blue Shield in North America, and they basically cover the health insurance for over a third of North Americans, and these are working age 18 to 65. And they had some very troubling statistics, Amy. They showed that between the years of 2013 and 2017, just a 4 or 5 year period, the rates of younger individuals developing dementia, people under 30s and 40s and 50s, increased by over 300%. And that was way before we had problems with the pandemic, et cetera, which were also risk factors for dementia. This is a new phenomenon where people that, normally you think of dementia happening in somebody in their 80s and 90s, but that's happening now in the 30s and 40s and 50s at a much higher rate. So
that's incredible. So when you were first mentioning that, something that really stood out to me is how much of a risk and change you've seen in that young population. So you were saying, I just want to reiterate this to make sure everyone really heard that, 30s, 40s, maybe 50s are experiencing Alzheimer's and dementia at a rate of like 300% more than just a few years ago. Did I get that right?
yes.
That's crazy. I always think of it as like my grandparents' disease, but that's my age. That's nuts to think about.
We're all at risk, no question about it.
Yeah. Many people think of Alzheimer's as just forgetfulness, which is right in line with that. But what's a surprising fact about how it's actually impacting the brain, like the role of the hippocampus? I know you often have discussed this.
Yeah, the entire brain can shrink 10, 20% over time. And, many people just attribute that to, well, that's just normal aging. Well, no, it is aging, but it's not because of aging. It is actually because of something that is occurring to you, some risk factor that is affecting you as you age. And so we need to stop blaming age, because age has very little to do with dementia risk, other than the fact that if we're exposed to risk factors, the longer we live, the more we're exposed to that. So the answer is figuring out what those risk factors are, come up with a good plan to address each one of them, and then feel good about the fact that as we move into the golden years of our life, that we're going to have more functionality rather than less.
Amazing. I can't wait to keep digging into this. We have some questions that have come in locally that we want to switch to and answer right now.
Hey, Doc. I'm a moderately fit female who just turned 67, and I'm starting to notice large lapses in memory, like forgetting what I ate for breakfast. But it's not always that bad. Should I be concerned?
Yes, absolutely. You should be concerned because, you said it yourself, large lapses of memory. Even if it was what you might consider to be minimal lapses of memory, nobody should be having any lapse of memory at any age. And so that is one of your original clues that something needs to be done. Now, let me start with the bad news. The bad news is that this actually snowballs. It doesn't just happen periodically like you're experiencing now. It will keep getting worse and more frequent, and it'll snowball. And so unless you do something about it, the first goal is to slow down the cognitive decline. They go, whoa, wait a minute. I don't want to just slow this down. I want to stop it and reverse it. And I go, I get it. That's number 2 and number 3 goal. But the first step, we got to slow it down. Now, when we're slowing it down, that means that these large lapses of memory are still happening, but they're less intense and less frequent. So the final step is to be able to begin to reverse aspect of that cognitive decline. And that's absolutely possible. And to answer that question more directly, dementia is actually a temporary cognitive impairment. I'm reading this right from my book, associated with acute exposure to one or more dementigens. So our goal is to figure out what are the dementigens that are contributing to your lapse of memory. So once you know that you're being exposed to one or more dementigens that collectively are crossing this threshold level, leading to decreased functionality in judgment, communication, organization, and the normal functions of daily living. So the key is figuring out all the things that might be promoting that memory decline, okay, and all the things that can help reverse that and fix as many of the things as you can. And again, that's what we're going to be talking about.
I've noticed in my experience some older folks who I know have sharp minds and tend to have a positive attitude, and a number of those experiencing dementia have often had a negative outlook on life. Is there any correlation there?
Absolutely, there's a correlation there. So we talked earlier about the attitude of gratitude. When we have a positive outlook on life, that is good for the brain. It supports healing of the brain. It supports holding on to those 1,500 new hippocampal memory cells that are being produced every day as we sleep. And the key is, are we holding on to those? So a positive attitude is one of the many factors that can help hold on and keep those neurons alive so they can function for us over time. Now, the negative attitudes are more commonly associated with dementia for a couple of reasons. Number one is if you're starting to experience cognitive decline, you're talking about something and halfway through your explanation, you forgot what you're talking about. Okay, and so that's very embarrassing in a social situation. So you're more likely to withdraw from social scenarios so that you don't embarrass yourself. That's why we got to rethink the problem and be open about what's going on so that others around us can actually help us improve as well.
What is the earliest official sign of dementia setting in? What is the earliest sign that someone would notice?
There's many ways to look at this. Researchers have actually mentioned that one of the earlier signs of dementia is weak leg muscles. And so that should motivate us to work out. Because if we don't use it, we lose it. If we don't work out our legs in particular and strengthen our legs by doing appropriate type of exercise for our health and not injuring ourselves in any way, I encourage most of my patients to actually initially work with a trainer to make sure that they're developing an exercise program that's appropriate for their current abilities and medical conditions. So there's a unique relationship between the strength of our muscles and how that corresponds and interrelates and interfaces with our brain, actually making our brain more resilient. So when you work out your muscles, you're actually improving your brain function at the same time.
That's amazing. That's crazy to think that our muscles in our legs are really impacting what's going on up here in our head. Thank you for sharing that. Now, you've shared some stories like Glenn Campbell's diagnosis at the Mayo Clinic. What's an intriguing detail from that case or a similar case that shows how Alzheimer's sneaks up on even high-profile individuals?
Whenever I see high-profile cases like Glenn Campbell, Bruce Willis, Robin Williams, etc., I'm always thinking, wow, I wish that I would have had access to helping that individual do broader testing earlier on so we could determine what the early risk factors are and start fixing as many of them as possible. So the overall goal is to find as many underlying triggers as we can. The more triggers we find, the more triggers that we can fix or improve or optimize, getting us closer and closer to that tipping point where now we're not only slowing down the condition, but possibly stopping the progression of that disease and maybe even beginning to reverse aspects of it as well. And anytime I see somebody in the media that is struggling with dementia, and we're seeing that more and more and more often now because it's such a big problem, especially earlier on in age, I asked that question. I wonder if we could have basically slowed this down or stopped it or begin to improve progression if we would have caught it earlier. And of course, we don't know until we actually apply those strategies.
Something that you've also talked in the past about is a link between depression and dementia or Alzheimer's. Yeah, I believe you've talked about that there could be a 200 to 300% increased risk of that. Tell us a little bit about that. What's the connection there between depression and Alzheimer's?
Well, depression, normally we just think of depression as I'm not feeling that great. But depression is actually a depression of the brain. So we need to think about when we talk about depression, we're essentially saying our brain is depressed. And so the very same risk factors that promote depression are also the same risk factors that promote dementia or Alzheimer's type. So there's different forms of dementia, but the bottom line is that depression is always a risk factor because it has to do with many of the same variables. So the good news is that if we have depression and we address the underlying risk factors or triggers, now we're also helping limit the progression of dementia risk or even potentially stop it altogether and reverse what we have.
Thank you for explaining that. Genetics often get blamed, but you've busted this myth around this. Is Alzheimer's truly destiny if it runs in our family?
Its short answer is no, it is not our destiny. The genetics is important, but what we do about the choices that we have in life, and especially once we take the time to educate ourselves and really understand what the most likely triggers are of this tendency to dementia that might have occurred in a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle. So it's important to understand a lot of people will just use that as an excuse to say genetics really isn't that important. No, genetics really is important. I recommend genetic studies, detailed genetic studies on every patient. So if you have a single copy of the APOE4 mutation for Alzheimer's, that increases your relative risk of developing dementia compared to those who do not have the gene mutation by over 300%. It's actually 300 to 500%. That's not a mild risk. That's a substantial risk. In public health, when there's like 20% greater risk for this or a 30% greater risk for that, we hear newspaper headlines about that. Well, having that one gene increases the relative risk by 300 to 500%. That's major. But we can undo that risk by paying attention to the things that actually cause the problem. The gene doesn't cause the problem. The gene sets us up to have higher risk if we're exposed to the risk factors. We can diagnose all kinds of things, risk factors, but we can reverse the vast majority of them. If you don't know about them, we don't know what to do.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, toxins can play a huge role in your work. What's the most shocking toxin you've encountered, such as mold or heavy metals, and how did it contribute to cognitive decline in one of your cases?
It just depends how you look at this. And when I thought about most shocking toxin, it's not shocking to me that mercury is neurotoxic. It's not shocking to me that lead and arsenic and those type of heavy metals are neurotoxic. We've known this in the scientific literature for many, many decades, and so we pay attention to it. We measure it. We recognize its role in causing dementia over time, and it's toxic exposure is one of the top 5 categories of risk that we need to evaluate. And indeed, mold, and maybe mold is a little bit more shocking because there's for a long time I believed that mold had no impact on my health until I got tested, until I tested myself for urinary mycotoxins or toxins that come from mold, and I just did it because I was doing it for other patients and I was curious. I didn't think I was going to have a problem. I really didn't. But what I didn't realize is that my body genetically held and epigenetically as well held on to mold toxins. And every year it kept building up. building up to the point where it was a major problem. And so that's why I am on a regular, rational, natural detoxification program that begins with a high fiber diet and with sweating on a daily basis through exercise and a far infrared sauna. So all those things can help detoxify me naturally to help gradually remove the burden that I'm more susceptible to.
Interesting. That is pretty incredible and shocking. And good thing you were able to test that early on to see what was going on and get that under control. Can you tell us a little bit about sundowning syndrome and its devastating effect? Can you share the inspiring story about that from your book, as well as give us a little bit of a rundown around what sundowning is as well?
Sundowning refers to about the time the sun goes down, and usually even a couple hours before that, as the day is winding down. People with sundowning syndrome, which is usually an expression of some form of dementia, they start becoming really anxious, very uncomfortable. They may start hallucinating. In this case, this lady who was in her mid-70s was hallucinating, and she kept saying she was packing her bags in her suitcases and then trying to get out the front door saying, I'm going to go live with my mother, who had been dead for 30 years already. Can you imagine her husband, who loved her desperately? They'd been high school sweethearts, and he was literally in love, still in love with this woman at the highest level. And so he was begging the neurologist, and says, no, don't put her in hospice. Okay, now, and basically the neurologist says, you're going to ruin your own health by being her primary caregiver. Literally, this happened every evening for 3 years.
Wow.
It's a major disturbance to the family, to the couple's lives, to just emotional health for both of them. This neurologist had actually been to a lecture I had given the previous year at the annual international meetings of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. So he goes like, well, Dr. Youngberg talks about that there's things that can be done. Maybe that can help. And so he took that 1% of hope and said, okay, I'm going to spend time calling Dr. Youngberg. So he didn't have internet. He would go to a payphone once a month and talk to me for an hour.
Wow.
And she could not change anything. She was so demented. She was essentially in a vegetative state. But he started applying every single strategy for her, every single one. Within 3 months, and this shocked me because I didn't expect this, that sundowning syndrome went away. She stopped basically, wasting her husband's time 3 to 4 hours every evening. But that's not where it stopped. And so I actually wrote my book based on their story. When her neurologist did the hippocampal volumetrics test, which is an MRI that looks at how much of your memory consolidation center of your brain, the hippocampi, is left, she was less than first percentile. Wow. It was basically wiped out. Okay. And even with that, she improved dramatically. So nobody can tell me. I would never give somebody no hope. I will always tell them there's always hope, but you got to do the work. So never give up. Never say that there's nothing that we can do about this, no matter how demented they are, because the brain is highly resilient.
I think I have goosebumps hearing that story. That is so inspiring. I would never have imagined that was even possible. So what a hope-filled message that is. An area that often can get tied to dementia is this topic of sleep. It's underrated, but you've noted how poor sleep prevents brain detoxification. What's a surprising tip to optimize sleep and boost cognitive restoration overnight?
The sleep is a very, very critical, fundamental, foundational strategy that has to be figured out. It's one of the 3 most important foundations if the brain is going to repair. You got to have proper rest. As you pointed out, Amy, the brain detoxifies through the lymphatic system at night only when you're sleeping. And so if you're not sleeping properly, you're not detoxifying properly, and your brain is now exposed to more toxins, which means greater risk of dementia progression. One of the steps to address here is that most people don't sleep well because they're not doing the other strategies well. Okay, in other words, the more you start incorporating the other fundamental strategies, the other simple remedies, etc., that your body is now more likely, more capable of inducing sleep earlier and for longer. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm just saying let's figure this out together over time. Don't give up on that. So the three most important strategies that I'll plug in right now are: you got to figure out sleep. You got to optimize sleep. You want to go to sleep earlier and get up earlier. You want to have the amount of sleep that you get before midnight has been shown to be about double the benefit than the sleep after midnight. So circadian rhythm, the timing of when the sun goes down, when the sun comes up, also matters here. And that, even going to bed late, even in young people, cause shrinkage of the hippocampal neurons. But here's a couple quick, simple remedies that can be good for sleep. One of them, if you're struggling with this, take an Epsom salt bath. That magnesium sulfate in Epsom salts, take a whole cup of it and pour it in a hot bath and just soak in that hot bath maybe a half hour before going to bed, and that helps relax the body. So that's one tip that can help you. Turn off all your electronic devices about 2 hours before you're planning to go to bed. Basically, that's a hard thing for a lot of people to do, but being exposed to that type of light from screen light right before bed interferes with the ability to sleep properly. So that's another little tip for you as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Those are some tips that I'm going to try in my own routine in life. So thank you for that. Dr. Youngberg, thank you for coming out and joining us today. You really hit it out of the park with all of this information on how we can protect our brains and make sure that they are gaining and not shrinking as we age. Thank you again for joining us. If you've enjoyed this week's episode of Ask the Doctor, please join us for next episode, as this conversation is still ongoing. In fact, you can also be a part of this conversation if you submit your questions to askthedoctor@3abn.ca and leave your message there. Thanks for watching.